Thank you very much, Madam Deputy President. I'll be very short in my comments today. When I first saw this, I was astounded that there's a pecuniary interest available at the current time for prosecution. Now, if a pecuniary interest is not an incentive to find or fabricate vexatious complaints, then I don't know what is. The mere fact that of the 20 complaints, some 13 were either unsuccessful or withdrawn, I would suggest showed that there was some incentive there. But there was something deeper than that, Madam Deputy President, something which registered in the back of my mind in the dim distant past in relation to private prosecutions and the pecuniary benefit which might flow from them. And I'll be bringing Mr Foley in later to support my argument. However, more of that later. For those of you who may be aware, in the 18th century, the British Crown attempted to monopolise trade in North America, and it introduced a number of acts called the Navigation Act, the Molasses Act, and finally the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act was basically a monopolistic trade device, and the Act allowed customs officials to transfer smuggling cases from colonial courts with juries to juryless Vice Admiralty courts. Well, why would they do this? Well, because up until 1768, Vice Admiralty judges were awarded 5% of all confiscated cargo and ships, which was a clear incentive to come to a guilty verdict. Not only that, but the Vice Admiralty courts also reversed traditional judicial ideology by burdening the defendant with the task of disproving the charge of smuggling rather than assuming innocence until guilt was proven. So what we have here is a pecuniary benefit and a reversion of interests. What does that remind us of? Well, it reminds us exactly of the current situation in New South Wales. Later on, the British introduced the Townsend duties, which tightened their supervision of colonial trade. Now, like all cases adjudicated under the Sugar Act, defendants were assumed to be guilty until they could prove otherwise. Moreover, informers were awarded 1/3 of all goods and ships confiscated from smugglers. This is the informers. An incentive to falsify charges and report shippers who committed even the slightest offences. And once the cases were transferred to the Vice Admiralty courts, they had a very high rate of conviction. Again, an instance where an informant is paid a substantial amount of money for a successful prosecution, and also where the onus of proof has been reversed. What does that remind us of today? This was an 18th century law. Now, customs officers during this time enforced the duties vigorously and in an underhand manner, often relaxing certain technical restrictions for a time period and then suddenly clamping down. Again, the same incentive which is available to unions, they will turn the other way until the problem becomes so great that they know that they will get a successful prosecution and a very large payout for the nature of that prosecution. This became known, and I'll say it here, as customs racketeering. This was defined as racketeering, and it amounted to little more than legalised piracy. The activities of the agents, and especially the informers, provoked considerable opposition from the American colonists. So, where does Mr Foley come in, I hear members opposite asked? Well, Mr Foley, I'll take that interjection. Mr Foley comes in because, like other honourable members, he introduced the American Declaration of Independence in his maiden speech. He said, and I quote, "I draw inspiration from one of the great radical documents in human history, the American Declaration of Independence. What was radical in 1776 was the notion that government arose from the people and was not a gift to them or an imposition on them. The American Declaration of Independence established the concept of human rights for the first time in history as the basis for a nation." This is the same Declaration of Independence which was occasioned by these horrible restrictive laws, this customs racketeering, this reversal of the onus of proof, this clear incentive to come to a guilty verdict and have paid informants. Mr Foley was so outraged by... Mr Foley was so supportive of the outrage expressed by the American colonists at this time for exactly the same sort of things which he gets up in the House and now proclaims are a perfectly acceptable modus operandi. Members, Mr Foley's word cannot be taken as serious in this matter. It's clear that he does not know what he's talking about, and I commend the bills to the House.
The Honourable Mick Veitch.